Thank you for joining us in this panel discussion on mental health science. I'm Eamon McCrory, Professor of Developmental Neuroscience and Psychopathology at UCL, and also Director of UKRI's Adolescent Mental Health and Wellbeing Research Programme. And I'm really delighted to be chairing this panel with Lizzie Mitchell. And Lizzie, I wonder whether you might want to say a few words to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Ayman. Hi, everyone. My name's Lizzie, and I've been a lived experience advisor on several research projects, most recently with the UKRI, which is where I met Ayman. I'm also in my final year doing an undergrad in psychology, and I work in CAMHS inpatient and outpatient clinics.
Thanks, Lizzie. And Lizzie and I will be chairing the panel, and over the next 50 minutes, we're going to be exploring potentially quite a broad topic, and it's going to be fascinating to hear what the panelists bring. Really, I think we're going to be discussing what we mean by mental health science and how we can build a research community to deliver it, how we can accelerate our understanding of why mental health problems emerge and how they unfold across development, and how this understanding in turn can translate into improved and perhaps even radically different approaches to prevention and intervention. To realise these opportunities, we need to reflect on what needs to change in the way we do science, who is doing the science, and how we can work more collaboratively with those affected by mental health problems and understand what barriers stand in our way. To explore these issues, we're joined by a highly experienced set of panelists who are able to draw on a wide range of expertise. And these include Miranda Wolpert from Wellcome, EmilyHolmes from Uppsala University, Praveetha Patalay from UCL, Golam Khandaker from the University of Bristol, and GraceGatera from Wellcome. So each panelist will speak for a short 2-minute slot, very challenging, and then handing over to the next speaker to save us some time. And after all of the presentations, Lizzie and I will be making some brief reflections on what we've heard before we move into the panel discussion and putting your questions to the panel. So Lizzie, I wonder if I can hand over to you now to introduce our first speaker, Miranda Wolpert.
Sure, thank you. So I'm delighted to introduce Miranda, who is Director of Mental Health at the Wellcome Trust and Professor of Evidence-Based Research and Practice in Mental Health at UCL. So over to you, Miranda, and if you could introduce Emily once you're finished, that would be amazing.
Will do. Thank you very much, and lovely to be here. On this topic of radical ways forward to mental health science, it's something that we think a lot about at Wellcome. And as people will know if they heard me earlier, we're a big biomedical research charity, and we give out about £1 billion a year, and mental health is now one of the key areas that we are focused on going forward. And we believe that there is a real opportunity here. We're at the start of a journey for creating a new form of mental health science, building on fantastic work that's gone before, but also trying to address the challenges that we see existing. And those challenges are in terms of both who does the science, who they do the science on and with, to what end they're doing the science, how they communicate the science, and what tools they use for that science. So I'll try and remember those and go through each in turn, just say a quick thing on each. So in terms of who does the science, we really want to think about mental health science community as ranging from biologists to anthropologists to people in the humanities to people, psychologists and psychiatrists. And one of the challenges and opportunities to bring those different languages together. I think MQ is an absolute example of trying to do this fantastically, but as people who've been here for the 2 days will know, sometimes things are very hard to understand if you're coming from a different part of the woods of mental health science. So trying to work out how we translate across and work together remains an exciting challenge. The second thing is in terms of who we do the research on and with. So there's very much been emphasis at this conference on working with those with lived experience, and I think that is exactly the way we want to go forward. And we also need to make sure that we are thinking as globally as possible to get the greatest range of people. So we want to move outside the weird countries, the Western, industrialized, educated, rich and democratic, and make sure we are getting information from a much wider group of people, and also that we are not narrowly focused on only those that access services, when we know that the vast majority of people with mental health problems don't access services. So we need to understand what happens to them and their trajectories. Then in terms of the impact, what we're trying to achieve, I suppose it's trying to be focused always on thinking about the ways it will help people not be held back by mental health problems. And that sometimes may mean that we start with trying to find out what works and then try and work out why it works, rather than always assuming that we will go back from causes, up from causes through to solutions. In terms of the tools we might use, We're very keen that we need some harmonisation of metrics, and people have talked about that in the conference today. And we have agreed that going forward, we and other funders, we have taken the radical step that we will only fund people in anxiety and depression research if they use some core measures. They can use as many other measures they like, but they need to use some agreed core measures. And that is accessible and available, and our rationale for that, but we're happy to talk about that. And finally, how we communicate what we do. I think we need to become, as a community, more comfortable with learning in public, sharing our failures, sharing what we don't know. I think as a mental health science community, we've perhaps been sometimes feeling beleaguered, and therefore sometimes I think we felt that we've had to oversell or say we know things when we don't quite yet know. And I think allowing ourselves not to know is part of the journey of developing into a more mature scientific field. So with those provocations, I'm now going to hand over to Emily, who I'm delighted to hand over, is a clinical psychologist and neuroscientist known for her research on mental health imagery in relation to psychological treatments for PTSD, bipolar disorder and depression. She's professor in psychology at Uppsala University in Sweden and in clinical neuroscience at the Karolinska Institute, also in Sweden, and she serves on the board of the trustees of MQ.
Cool. Hi, thank you so much, Miranda, for that fantastic kickoff to our session. And I wanted to pick up on the last thing you said, which is about learning in public. And I think that's exactly what we're doing in the session today, because mental health science is an incredibly new and an edgy field in a way. And as this slide shows, I just want to talk you through a little bit of the very recent history. So in 2014, with Michelle Krask, who gave the keynote just this afternoon, and Anne Graybell, who works in optogenetics, we talked about an umbrella discipline. And when we talk about umbrellas, I guess the image there is trying to get people under the same umbrella to address common problems and goals. But just as Miranda said, bring them in from all over the place. Like, it doesn't matter on the discipline. Disciplines can work together across body and mind, from social sciences, as it were, through to more biological sciences. But we've got to have a common goal. And I think the thing to forge ahead is about making a difference, like creating impact, improving treatments and interventions. And we sort of took the mental health science idea for a bit of a walk through a commission on psychological treatments in 2018. And one of the key learning points for me around that was really about even learning, learning in public there, putting together people who are working in clinical spaces and laboratory spaces at the same time to have very edgy discussions about mechanisms, but also about kind of really trying to think differently, like, why are we even inventing interventions that won't work globally from the get-go, like trying to have a much bigger global vision from the get-go. And I guess in 2020, taking a mental health science perspective, we thought a little bit about really trying to make more central the importance of working with experts by lived experience. And there's a lot to be done in that space. It's been fantastic at this conference, and really needs to drive the agenda forward. And I guess in 2020-21, trying to think about inequalities and how that fits into it all. So 2022, 23, 24, this developmental trajectory that mental health science is on, I guess really important questions, and there are many, is who gets to be a mental health scientist and stay a mental health scientist? And the reason that that's incredibly important about is that the agents of research often are those driving the research questions and the way they're being asked. So I wanted to end on this really old quote from the 1920s by Albert Einstein, which is, the mere formulation of a problem is far more essential than its solution, which may merely be a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. That's the tools part. To raise new questions, new possibilities, to regard old problems from a new angle requires creative imagination and marks real advances in science. And if I could wish anything going forward in co-creating mental health science, it's that we're doing things that mark real advances. Thank you. So the next speaker is, and I'm delighted and honoured to present, you can take the slide away now, Praveetha Patalay. Praveetha is Associate Professor at University College London. She's based in the MRC unit of Lifelong Health and Ageing at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, and is renowned for her really exciting programme of work illuminating, among other things, inequalities in mental health science and youth populations. Delighted to hand over to you, Praveetha.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. Imagine we were in a room together somewhere for this conference, and the temperature was set intentionally to be really cold. And the conference organizers suggest people can move about, buy jumpers, purchase hot drinks to help keep themselves warm. People with a biological vulnerability to the cold would struggle more. Women on average would feel colder than men, and those with better health or resources would cope better. Most people would say, surely, the obvious thing to do here is to increase the temperature instead. This is like current mental health science. We focus most resources on working out who has the greater biological vulnerability to mental ill health and on the specific things individuals can do themselves to improve their own mental health. And then, of course, on how we treat after individuals get seriously ill. These are all really important endeavors. However, they are all limited in what they can achieve when we ignore the context in which our mental health is produced. Because when the temperature in the room is cold, not only is it bad for everyone, it widens inequalities because the people with the least resources, and I mean resources here in the widest sense, to keep themselves warm, suffer most. So to really change this, we need to, firstly, widen the disciplines involved in mental health science to include people interested in the wider social and policy context that produce our health, and to how we improve these social and policy contexts. And secondly, we need to widen the context and people we focus on. There's power imbalances, both, as Miranda already mentioned, globally, so where research is done, but also within societies, power imbalances contribute greatly to inequality. And all of the studying genes and brains is not going to help fix that if we don't also acknowledge these and tackle these head on. So my wish for mental health science is that we join forces across disciplines and stakeholders to understand better the depressogenic environments we are creating as a society and reconsider what we value as societies and the structural forms of discrimination and power that result in inequalities in health. Because if we truly, really want to reduce inequalities and for all of us to live a healthier and more fulfilling life with well-being, we need to involve a wider range of folk, but we also need to work harder and work together at fixing the temperature in the room. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce the next speaker. Golam Khandaker is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Bristol and a Wellcome Trust Fellow and Program Lead at the MRC Integrative Epidemiology Unit. Golam, over to you.
Thank you, Praveetha. Mental health science, to me, means gaining insights into the full range of biological, psychological, and social factors for mental illness and also for resilience to mental illness, and use this knowledge to develop strategies for treatment and prevention. In focusing with conditions of the brain, we mustn't forget that there is a body attached to the brain. And so understanding brain-body interaction is very important. We know that mental illnesses start early, and so taking a life course perspective is critical in understanding onset and progression of mental disorders across the life course. So how do we build an effective research community for mental health science? To me, I think the key is to reach outside of our respective bubbles and start working with scientists and colleagues in other fields. And it's equally important that we reach out and work closely with people with lived experience. That's my introduction, and I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker, GraceGatera. Grace is a youth mental health advocate with lived experience living in Kigali, Rwanda. She serves as a strategic advisory board member for the Wellcome Trust and is a young leader for My Mind, Our Humanity, a youth campaign for the Lancet Commission on Global Mental Health and Sustainable Development. Grace, over to you.
Golam. I think that the people that have spoken before me have been particularly wonderful, and I've loved listening to them. And I also, when the talk of this panel came around, I thought about very hard. So I decided to go with my heart. And so, yeah, so I'll say this. To me, mental health science is a way to know more than we've ever known about mental health. It brings together fields around mental health research, academia, advocacy, policy, data, and evidence. And as a person with lived experience growing up, my view of mental health science was really technical and really closed off. I never thought I would ever work within anything closely related to mental health science because I don't have a background in research or science. Additionally, a lot of the work or a lot of the mental health science fields that I've seen while supporting communities in LMICs do not have a lot of LMIC representation. Again, one of the other reasons I did not think that I belonged within mental health. This makes it not very accessible to people like me, yet it is supposed to be helping people like me. However, you may ask me, what is the future of mental health science as I see it? And this is a vision that I've seen a lot of organizations, including Wellcome, that I work with, working towards. One that prioritizes what works for whom and why, and one that prioritizes working together cross-culturally, cross-sectorally for the best possible outcomes, and one that incorporates experts by experience in every one of those processes and every part of mental health science. I'm really happy to be a part of that future, and that is why I'm here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of the panel for your contributions. So much to cover. So I just first of all like to ask the audience, remind you that you can submit your questions, so I'd really encourage you to do that, and we can begin to present those to the panel. But we've heard a number of different issues raised. We've heard really that mental health is not something that can just be encapsulated. We need to really understand it at different levels, from the biological, the psychological, and the social, and that those levels need to be integrated in ways that allow us to have a more holistic understanding of how mental health problems emerge across development, and how we might intervene to either prevent or to treat mental health problems. But that complexity then speaks to the challenges that were raised about, well, who does the science? How do we come together across disciplines and different sectors in order to do that science? And that raises real questions about equality of access, how we collaborate, how we create models and frameworks, as Miranda was saying, in terms of languages and structures, so we can bring the humanities, we can bring the biologists and the psychologists and the social scientists together, and also in a way that can then speak to policymakers and practitioners. This is really complicated, and but it sounds like there is a real desire to move the field forward and address some of these very long-standing silos and patterns of fragmentation in the field, and to address some of the inequalities that were also spoken about in terms of the power imbalances and how people are working together in ways that address shared problems and not just the problems that are prioritized by a select few. So those are my initial thoughts. I think it's a fascinating area that we can explore. Lizzie, I'm wondering what your initial thoughts are from the panel.
Thanks. It was lovely to hear all you speak. There's some amazing points and just too much to discuss. I think I'm really pleased to see that mental health is being a priority, and also that it's now being defined as a science, because I think for a long time it's been quite an abstract concept for so many people. So it's really nice that it's finally being investigated as a scientific concept. I think the points about learning in public are just so important, and I think along those lines, linking to Emily's slide, it's that anyone can make an impact and anyone can contribute to propelling mental health science forward. I think it's important to draw on disciplines outside of research-based roles as well. So like teachers, youth workers, even parents, they've all got a role to play, and every person will have a unique perspective. And I think it's only really when we collaborate with those people as well that we can really drive the field forward. And I really like the point as well about asking people with experience what the question should be, rather than just asking them about trying to answer the questions. I think getting them to come up with questions to fill the gaps is equally as important. And I think something that's quite important as well, which kind of links to Praveetha's point, is trying to get young people involved and excited about mental health research. I think research is typically seen as something quite, not to offend anyone, quite boring, and something like the elite that only you can do if you've got PhDs. And I never thought I'd be sitting here as a young person being able to contribute to research as much as I have. So I can really relate to Grace on that point. And I think getting young people excited about research will really help to engage marginalised groups as well, because they can see that it's something for everyone rather than just for the elite. So yeah, now me and Eamon are going to take some questions. So Eamon, do you want to start?
Sure, and maybe just picking up, Lizzie, on that question, I wonder if we could ask the panel, what would you say are the things we could begin to do now to begin to change the kinds of questions that are being asked, and changing who is doing the mental science research in the future? How can we begin to change who really has the agency in the field of what's being asked? And that might be, for example, in relation to training, you know, the people coming into the research field. I think that was a great point about, you know, it's really the formulation of the problem that's really important, not just the solution. So how can we change those problems being formulated? Miranda.
I guess sort of taking up what Emily said, I think we would benefit from spending more time formulating what we see as being the problem and the practical opportunities within it, rather than as I think sometimes we have it like, this is your field of study, you now have to stick in your field of study and you develop your career through that field of study. So if groups came together and really tried to tease apart what's the problem, what's the opportunity. So I'm just thinking, for example, of Golam's fantastic work on neuroimmunology, which I'm just starting to sort of get my head around some aspects of. One of the things that I think would benefit from is an engagement with the cutting edge work on metrics and what you measure in terms of what actually is depression. And actually, if we brought those two fields together, which at the moment I'm not aware of speaking to each other really at all, there's actually an opportunity that you might measure different things, both in terms of the biology, but also in terms of the psychology or the psychiatry. And so I think there are sort of some unusual relationships that could be brokered, that could lead to new formulated questions, but we have to have, so I suppose for me it's about space for people to think together, what's a key question that we're all interested enough in to work on together.
That's really helpful, Miranda, and about looking at these things in an emergent phenomena way rather than breaking at the granular level, which leads to this fragmentation. Praveetha, sorry, I'll just go to Praveetha first.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Miranda. So, yeah, I think another thing to think about in terms of disciplines and who does mental health science is around so there's one question around sort of expertise and this idea of, you know, PhDs and stuff. And I think there's so many people around the world, especially if you think about young people's mental health. There's like most young people in the world are actually in India and Africa and not in the UK or in the US. And I think if we gave people the skills to think about research and science, even if they didn't have I think the PhDs are, you know, it's one type of training. But I think if you involve young people in thinking about solutions for their local communities and how they would go about evaluating those things or understanding those things, I think lots of us can be mental health scientists with just a little bit of encouragement and information and right sort of support. So I think it's really sort of important to sort of encourage programs that think out of the box on how we can involve people from across the piece in mental health science, because the academic route is one route, but equally there's so many other ways. And we're working, for example, with colleagues such as Victor Hugo and Sonali on sort of thinking about these types of models of how people across the world, but at younger ages, can start getting involved in research in ways that can really impact their community and their local community's mental health.
Thanks, Praveetha. Golam?
Thank you, Eamon. Picking up on Lizzie's question about who has the agency, I think we really need to rethink about how we train scientists. So in current framework, I mean, the scientist has the duty, if you like, to come up with a fantastic research hypothesis, a question, and then you design a rigorous investigation to test that hypothesis, and you come up with wonderful and bright results after that. But I think we need to work collaboratively, because what may be important to a psychiatrist or a clinician or scientist, hearing from the other side of the table, and I can speak both from my experience in research and as a psychiatrist working in the NHS, it may not be the most immediate priority to the person I'm seeing in clinic. So for example, we're doing currently a clinical trial of anti-inflammatory treatment for depression. So in designing the trial, we of course were interested in knowing whether it has an effect on mood symptoms, so and anxiety symptoms. But working with a number of colleagues, people with lived experience and their family members in our trust, it became very clear that the outcome measures, so-called things to measure in a study they were most interested in, is quality of life, how there is improvement into their day-to-day activities. And that really resonated with me when I was training as a psychiatrist in a service for young people with psychosis. So what I was most interested in at the time was, did my drug improve hallucinations or delusions? But it became very clear that the most useful or tangible improvement that the young person sitting in front of me wanted to see, whether they are able to form relationship, maintain friendship, and that sort of thing. So I think we really need to rethink how we organize research training and also clinical training into psychiatry and neuroscience in general. So we are more collaborative, not only when down the line when we come to design and implement study, but at the very beginning when we start thinking about what we should study in the first place.
That's such an important point, and I would totally agree. I think quite often researchers and young people have very different priorities, and I know that as a young person, when I was suffering from my mental health, all I wanted was a better quality of life, and I didn't really care about anything else. So I think sometimes just that communication between researchers and those with lived experience isn't there in the early stages of research. Miranda, did you have a point that you wanted to come on with?
Yes, I think it's one of the things I've been sort of thinking about as people have been talking is that I think mental health and science are problematic for two reasons. One, because I think everyone feels they're a mental health specialist because we've all got mental health and we all have our own experiences. And so one of the things I think we are challenged by, both as clinicians or lived experience advocates or anyone, is that someone will come in and say, well, my friend X happened or my experience is Y, and therefore that must apply to the whole world. And that's sort of true with the people who develop the interventions as much as it is with, so actually that's sort of slightly like, I have the truth and I'm now going to tell you the truth, is a problem I think in mental health science. So almost like everyone thinks they're a scientist. And then at the other end, it's almost like no one thinks they're a scientist. So no one thinks science is relevant here. And that they sort of think it's all so complicated that somewhere there's some magic clinician that understands it all, and they sort of outsource of their knowledge to this sort of magic group. So between those two extremes, I think we struggle to find a best way of doing the science. And I think, as Praveetha said, that I think whilst I completely agree people don't need PhDs, there's also a lot to learn about scientific design. If you want to be involved, you have to go through, which is quite tedious if you're not particularly interested in it. But if you don't engage with that, you can't also engage with the science. So there's no easy wins here, but there are some fantastic wins if we can achieve that. And I think it is, as people have been saying, if we can harness the curiosity and commitment for so many different groups. And I think as people start saying, citizen science, I think, is one of those ways of thinking about that. But it does take an understanding of how little we know to start that agenda, I think.
Thanks so much for that, Miranda. Grace, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Yes, I agree with all your points, but I would like to say that sometimes I look at it as not giving skills to people with lived experience or educating them, as opposed to capacity sharing or an exchange of ideas, because I believe that lived experience is a legitimate form of knowledge, and I believe that it has to have its place in mental health science. And while we might not be good at research or designing, solutions and all of those things, I get lost every time I talk about research. But I think that this is a great time to sort of share what we know so that we can build it together. Strength in collaboration as opposed to, and that also sort of takes away the researchers being up here and, lived experience people being down here. It brings us to a level playing field and establishes us as experts in our own right. Thank you.
That's a great point, Grace, and I really agree. I think it's about everyone coming together, because ultimately we all just want the same thing at the end of the day, which is improved outcomes for young people with poor mental health. The second question we've got is citizen science. We have the digital tools and access to underserved populations. So how can we develop a strand of work in that direction?
Miranda?
I can say what we're doing in relation to that, and I think there are a number of different ways. I'd be interested in other people's views. But one thing we are experimenting with at Wellcome is we are testing out the feasibility of collecting data about young people's lives in which they have much more control over how those data are collected, what's done with them, and that they become co-scientists with the people that might use those data. We've commissioned a group called Sage Bio Network, who are an American company, and they're working with collaborators in the UK and in India and South Africa. And we should have the results of that feasibility trial early next year, which is really seeing, is there a way of empowering people to be active decision makers, but also more active in sort of setting the research agenda and making use of those data. So it's a bit of an experiment for us to try out, but that's one way that we're trying to see if we can advance citizen science as part of our agenda.
Thanks, Miranda. And Praveetha?
Just to sort of follow up on those thoughts, I think these are really nice initiatives, but again, I think we should really think carefully about who they exclude, because obviously when you have, anything that is based on access to the internet, or even just willingness to take part in something, you always exclude other people. So if we just should make sure that, like, what we know about mental health science going forward doesn't only come from data that is volunteered by people selecting into these projects, but we want to understand the mental health of everyone, even the people who don't opt into these things. So I think, yes, completely pro, we will learn useful things from this, but equally always to remember we're probably excluding some people. That's all I wanted to say. Sorry.
No, thanks, Praveetha. That's really helpful. And we're getting some comments from the audience, and people are really talking about the way in which the research process has so many different layers. And I suppose the challenge is, how do we bring in the different agents as part of that? We need experts in methodology, in analysis, but we also need expertise in lived experience, as well as intervention and clinical change and systems change. So one question really is, how do we forge a field that creates the conditions where that kind of collaboration is supported and possible? And I suppose there's a role there for funders, and that's one aspect of the process, but there's also a role for how we as individual scientists or clinicians think and work together. And I'm wondering whether the panel feel that there are specific things we could either do as funders or as individual scientists to try and more proactively approach that scientific endeavor with that kind of collaborative mindset.
I've got a point on that. I think one thing is removing the hierarchy. I think a lot of the time, especially as a young person being involved in research, I have been involved in some projects where you kind of feel like you're bottom of the pile, and like you're there to kind of give your story, which is then kind of, I don't want to say used as a sob story, but it's kind of used as to justify why their research is being done. and you might be asked like really menial questions which aren't really that important to the project, and you kind of feel like you're just there to like tick a box on the funding form rather than actually contribute in a meaningful way. So I think in order for collaboration to succeed overall, I think everyone needs to have an equal role in the research and feel like they are contributing equally to it. And obviously people with PhDs are going to know way more than I do about science and methodology, but I know what it's like to have mental health issues and wake up every day and feel those things and live with those thoughts, and that's something that you can't teach at university. So I think recognising everyone's strengths is really important in collaboration.
I think that's so helpful, Lizzie, because it's really about valuing different forms of evidence, valuing different forms of understanding, because it is this multifactorial challenge that we're grappling with. And I suppose science in the past has had suffered from the fact that it's tended to prioritize, very kind of data-driven, conceptually specific forms of evidence rather than really thinking more broadly. And the fact we haven't really progressed significantly as a field in arriving at successful treatments suggests that we need to do something differently. Emily, did you want to come in at the point?
Yeah, I'd like to endorse maybe even more strongly what Lizzie said, actually, because if we just, it's a lot, I think it actually has got to go back down to the questions again. Because if we really stop to think, from what a lot of people are saying at the moment, like where lived experience has expertise over scientists is in what matters. Scientists are doing science careers. Lived experience is about what questions are right. And if I go back to the Einstein quote, which I put up as an example that most people would agree with, quite a decent scientist, he says it's really not about the methods and tools. It's not about whether we're using a brain scanner or the best survey. It's about getting the questions right and then coming around those questions to create a shared goal. So that all goes back to Praveetha's point about power. How are we actually how are we working on questions? Like, dare we say, for example, depression doesn't actually exist. It's just a construct. So the real power balance question would be, how do we work with lived experience to say, well, what does matter? And that goes back to Golam's point about with people you're actually seeing want to have functional differences in their lives. Why isn't a core question around, why aren't we working together saying, well, what might be the really interesting questions about functioning and really puzzling that out and then going for it. So I think it does need a much bigger push than we've already made if we really want to see a difference. That's
so interesting, Emily. It's challenging ourselves as a field to potentially look really hard at some of those basic assumptions we have. What is mental health? What is well-being? What is depression? How do we formulate those concepts? And is there a shared understanding of those with those who have mental health problems and across the different disciplines with whom we're working?
But even throwing the disciplines a bit out of the box with the bathwater, like maybe it is more about the global perspective as well, because, I'm a bit of a, Lizzie, this is where we differ. I am a science nerd, so I do spend my free time reading things like the biography of Linnaeus, which is really boring. But like, if we wanted to classify plants, we just go and, we have to go back and we have to think globally from the start, not UK first, then globally. So I think that somehow around the edges of what we're talking about requires an incredible flip of perspectives that we haven't quite got to.
And I think some of the comments that we've had coming in, which I think the panel would very much share, is that working with other countries, that is through collaboration. It's as much about what we can learn from other countries and other cultures and other groups as much as they might learn from us. And that's all part of the same collaborative spirit of openness, of curiosity, of coming together under the same umbrella, as it were, in order to advance our understanding.
But maybe trying to solve problems is more difficult and interesting than advancing understanding. That's the bit that I think that maybe we really need to listen and say, what do we need to solve together? Because we can't just keep mapping it out.
Well, that's exactly, it's like we need to understand what people mean by constructs, and then we need to understand how we investigate them, and then how do we use that information and knowledge to affect change. Because I think this came up in the young persons panel earlier, where the discussion was, well, it's great to be able to map the problem, it's great to have all of this data, but can we move that knowledge into impact and more effective approaches to prevention and intervention? Golam?
I would argue that actually to achieve both, so understanding and mapping the problem and having an impact for both of those, we really need to get outside of our bubbles and reach out to other people. And then that doesn't necessarily have to be scientists that we reach out to. To give an example of things that are keeping me busy right now, so studies of immunological mechanisms to mental illness, particularly depression and psychosis. If you pick out my best friends, so to speak, I cannot name anyone who's a psychiatrist. In the science, there is a rheumatologist, there is a mathematician, a geneticist, and so on. So we don't really need to be defined and by and work with the people who are working on the same thing like us or in the same field, and benefited hugely from input from people with lived experience. And the other point is basically, I agree with Emily that we need to think outside of UK, Europe, and think more globally. So Miranda and I were having a conversation about neuroimmunology the other day, and this is true for any, you could name any other field of discovery in mental health, genetics, and so on. Much of the evidence that is currently known is based on a particular white European population, whether certain risk factors are true or certain interventions are helpful for people in Africa or Asia. When we know now there are more than 200 genetic variants related to risk of schizophrenia and hundreds for depression. Is this the case for populations who are not white? We don't know. And we need to get out and think more globally, both for basic science and mechanistic understanding, and also for interventional, designing strategies for treatment and prevention.
That's so helpful, Golam, because it really reminds us, and that's really coming back in some ways, to the importance of personalized medicine. The idea that we have to be so careful in terms of making generalizations that something works for a whole population or works for everyone, because context really matters, culture matters, genes matter, individual differences in all those senses really have to be thought about in our approaches. And I think that's really helpful that there is this shift, but I don't think, as you said, it's gone far enough. Miranda.
If there's time, I just wanted to add to that, completely agree. And I think the parochialism can take form not just nationally, but also within our context. So I think one of the main things that has hampered mental health science is the focus on clinical populations. So, you know, I was brought up as a clinician thinking that depression was a chronic condition or a relapse-remitting condition. I now need to read the literature, and about half the people who have first episode of depression never have it again, but we know almost nothing about them because they don't come to our services. So we don't know about how those people recover or get better. There's a whole populations that we have cut out from our heads, and then we study the populations that may be the ones that sort of didn't manage those other things. So there may be all sorts of issues around those people. So just be careful of that bubble, both within context, you know, within our own nations as well as across nations.
Exactly, and that's a really helpful reminder to end with. And I think we've unfortunately reached the end of our time. Thank you all for an incredibly fascinating discussion. I think we could have had many more points to explore, but the limited time we've had, I think we've covered what we can. Lizzie, I don't know if I want to leave the last word for you.
Yeah, just thank you everyone for presenting. It's been really interesting and I've learned a lot, and thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Bye all.